Hospitals are built on foundations of blood and breath. Every corridor has witnessed the final sigh. Every room has held the space between a heartbeat and silence. The staff who work the night shifts will tell you that some things don't end with a flat line. Some things linger. These are 3 true accounts from hospital workers, security guards, and patients. People who encountered something in those sterile halls that no medical textbook could explain. The names have been changed, but the stories remain exactly as they were told. Story 1. The Attendant's Last Round. The morgue attendant had worked the sub-basement of St. Catherine's Hospital for longer than anyone could remember. His name was Frank, and he was a man of few words. The living exhausted him, but the dead were quiet. That was the arrangement he made with the world after a lifetime of noise he refused to speak about. He came on shift at 10 in the evening and left at 6 in the morning, and in those 8 hours, he was the sole keeper of the hospital's departed. The morgue was a place that most staff pretended did not exist. It sat 3 floors below ground level, accessible only by a single freight elevator that moved with the slow, reluctant groan of a thing that preferred to stay put. The corridor leading to it was narrow, lined with exposed pipes that sweated in summer and clanked like chains in winter. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but 2 of them had been dead for years, leaving pockets of shadow that Frank navigated by memory. He never bothered to fix them. He liked the dark. The suite consisted of 3 rooms, a small office with a desk cluttered with paperwork, a prep room with 3 stainless steel tables and drains in the floor, and the cooler. The cooler was a walk-in unit with a heavy insulated door that sealed shut with a latch that could only be opened from the outside. Inside, the temperature held at a constant cold that bit through clothing. The bodies were stored in retractable racks, each one a drawer with a toe tag and a sheet. Frank kept meticulous records. He had to. Every body that passed through his care had a story, and it was his job to ensure that story ended with dignity. For years, the routine was the same. Bodies arrived from the floors above, wheeled down in the elevator by orderlies who never stayed longer than necessary. They would slide the gurney into the prep room, hand Frank the paperwork, and leave as quickly as they came. Frank would log the intake, perform the identification, and place the body in the cooler. He worked alone, and he preferred it that way. But after a while, Frank began to notice things. Small things at first. He would return from his break to find the cooler door unlatched, a door he knew he had sealed tight. He would find the racks shifted, bodies moved from their assigned slots to different positions. Once, he discovered a toe tag that had been rewritten. The name was still the same, but the handwriting was not his. The letters were slanted, almost elegant, as if written by someone educated in a different century. Frank assumed it was a prank. Orderlies with dark humor, night shift nurses with time to kill. He never reported it. Complaints drew attention, and Frank had spent his life avoiding attention. The whispers started on a Tuesday. Frank was in the office, filling out intake forms for a Jane Doe who had been brought in after a hit and run. The cooler was full that night, 19 bodies, a high number even for a city hospital. He heard it from the prep room, a sound like someone running their finger along a stainless steel table. Slow, deliberate. Frank set down his pen and walked to the doorway. The prep room was empty. The tables gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but on the center table, the one he had wiped down hours earlier, there was a handprint. It was not a print made by a living hand. It was too pale, too slick, and it was pressed into the metal from below, as if someone had placed their palm against the underside of the table and pushed upward, leaving a residue that shimmered under the light. Frank stared at it for a long time. Then he took a rag from his pocket, wiped the table clean, and returned to his paperwork. He did not look back. Over the following weeks, the occurrences grew bolder. The whispers became voices, not words, exactly, but the shape of words. Frank would catch fragments in the hiss of the pipes, in the hum of the fluorescent lights. A syllable here, a vowel there. Once, He was certain he heard his own name, spoken from inside the cooler. He had pressed his ear to the insulated door and listened. Nothing. He unlatched the door and stepped inside. The cold air wrapped around him like a wet sheet. He walked down the narrow aisle between the racks, his breath fogging in the dim light. Every body was in its place. Every tag was correct, but as he turned to leave, he saw that the door had swung shut behind him. The latch had not engaged. He knew because the latch required a deliberate push from the outside. But the door was closed, and the interior handle, the one meant to prevent accidental lock-ins, was missing. It had been there that morning. Frank had used it to steady himself while changing a light bulb. He was locked in the cooler with 19 bodies. His hands did not shake as he pounded on the door. His voice did not crack as he called out. He knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones, that no one would hear him until morning. The morgue was too remote. The night shift did not come down here. He was alone. He sat with his back against the door and waited. The cold crept into him slowly, first through his trousers, then through his jacket, then into the marrow of his legs. He counted the minutes by the beating of his own heart. At some point, he must have drifted into a half-sleep, because he became aware of a presence standing in front of him. He opened his eyes. The aisle between the racks was empty, but the rack directly before him, the one containing the body of a woman who had died in the ICU 3 days earlier, had been pulled out. The sheet had been folded back. The woman's face was uncovered, her eyes closed, her expression peaceful. That was not how Frank had left her. He always covered the faces. It was a small courtesy, a ritual he performed without thinking. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down the aisle. One by one, the racks were sliding open. Not all at once, but in sequence, as if someone were walking down the line and releasing each drawer. The sound was a series of soft clicks and the whisper of metal on metal. Frank did not move. He watched as 17 racks slid open. 2 remained closed. He did not know which 2, and he did not want to know. The air in the cooler was no longer cold. It was warm, and it carried a smell that he recognized from his time in places he did not discuss. The smell of earth after rain, of damp stone, of something old that had been sealed away for too long. Then the voices came, not whispers this time, full voices, layered over one another, speaking in languages Frank did not recognize and in languages he knew too well. They spoke of pain and of waiting. They spoke of the living who had passed through their rooms and the hands that had touched them in their final moments. Frank heard the name of a nurse he knew, a kind woman who worked in oncology. He heard the name of a surgeon who had a reputation for being rough with patients under anesthesia. He heard his own name again, and this time it was followed by a question. Who will remember you, Frank? Who will come for you when you are the one on the rack? He did not answer. He closed his eyes and recited the only thing that had ever anchored him. A poem his mother had taught him when he was a boy, a simple thing about stars and the sea. He recited it over and over, his voice growing stronger as the voices around him grew louder. The metal racks began to vibrate. The sheets rustled as if the bodies beneath them were shifting. Frank kept his eyes closed and his voice steady. At 6 in the morning, the morning shift orderly found him. The cooler door was latched from the outside, but Frank was inside, sitting against it, his lips still moving. He had been there for 7 hours. His fingers were white with cold, and there was frost in his hair. The orderly helped him to his feet and asked what had happened. Frank looked at the racks. Every one of them was closed. The sheets were in place. The tags were all in his handwriting. He told the orderly that he had accidentally locked himself in and that the handle had broken. The orderly nodded, made a note, and never mentioned it again. Frank worked the morgue for another 10 years after that night. He never spoke of what happened, but those who worked with him noticed that he began to leave the cooler door open when he was working in the prep room. He started talking to the bodies as he processed them, not the formal identification questions, but soft, personal things. "You had kind eyes," he would say. "I'm sorry it ended that way." He would cover each face with extra care, tucking the sheet around the shoulders as if tucking a child into bed. When Frank retired, he left a note on his desk. It was addressed to whoever would take his place. It said only this: "They are not gone. They are only waiting. Speak to them. They are lonely." The new attendant found the note, read it, and threw it in the trash. Within a month, he requested a transfer. He told personnel that the morgue was too quiet. He did not elaborate. The next attendant lasted 2 weeks. The one after that requested a permanent night shift in the and never went near the sub-basement again. To this day, the morgue at St. Catherine's has no permanent attendant. Bodies are brought down by a rotating team of orderlies who work in pairs, never alone. They have a rule among themselves. When the cooler is full, they leave the door unlatched. And when they hear whispers from inside, they pretend they do not. Story 2. The 13th floor. The hospital had 12 floors. Everyone knew that. The elevator buttons went from L to 12. The stairwell signs listed floors 1 through 12. The official blueprints showed 12 floors. But the night shift nurses knew better. There was a 13th floor, and it existed in a space that had nothing to do with architecture. Margaret was a seasoned ICU nurse, 23 years on the job. She had worked through outbreaks, through blizzards that stranded staff for days, through codes that still visited her dreams. She did not spook easily. When new nurses whispered about the woman in the white dress who appeared at the foot of beds just before a patient coded, Margaret would tell them to focus on their vitals and leave the ghost stories to the living. She believed in what she could measure: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. Everything else was fatigue and suggestion. But there was a hallway on the 4th floor that she began to avoid. It was a short corridor, tucked between the old surgical wing and the newer addition, a relic from the hospital's original layout. It contained 4 rooms that had been converted to storage after the surgical wing was decommissioned. The rooms were filled with outdated equipment: iron lungs from the polio era, surgical lights with cracked reflectors, a wheelchair with leather straps that had once been used for something Margaret did not want to imagine. The hallway was always cold, and the air carried a faint smell of formaldehyde, though no formalin had been used in that section for decades. Margaret first noticed something wrong on a night when she was assigned to float to the 4th floor. The floor was understaffed, and she was helping cover the med-surg unit while a new nurse took her break. She needed a particular size of wound dressing that was not in the central supply, and a tech told her that the old storage hallway had a cabinet with extra supplies. Margaret walked the corridor alone. The lights flickered overhead, casting stuttering shadows that made the glass eyes of the iron lungs seem to follow her. She found the cabinet, retrieved the dressing, and was turning to leave when she heard a sound behind her. It was a soft, rhythmic creak, like a rocking chair moving slowly on old floorboards. She turned. The hallway was empty, but one of the storage room doors, which she was certain had been closed, was now open. The room inside was dark, but she could see the silhouette of the old wheelchair, and it was moving. The wheels were turning, just slightly, as if someone had just stopped pushing it. Margaret stood still for a moment, watching. The chair did not move again. She closed the storage room door, walked back to the unit, and told herself that old buildings settled, that air pressure changes could shift doors, that she had imagined the rest. She did not mention it to anyone, but the hallway began to draw her. That is the only way she could describe it. On nights when she worked the 4th floor, she would find herself walking past the corridor, glancing down it as she passed. Sometimes she would see the door open again. Sometimes the lights would be off, but she could see a pale shape standing at the far end, a shape that resolved into nothing when she looked directly at it. She started taking the long way to the break room, looping around through the main elevator bank instead of using the staff shortcut. She told herself it was because she needed the steps. The other nurses noticed. A young LPN named Denise, who worked the 4th floor full-time, pulled Margaret aside one night and asked if she had seen anything in the storage hallway. Margaret said no. Denise's face went pale. She said that the night staff on 4 had a rule: never go into the storage hallway alone, and never, under any circumstances, go into the room with the wheelchair after midnight. When Margaret asked why, Denise said that a patient had died in that room before it was converted. Not a peaceful death, a violent one. The details had been scrubbed from the records, but the old-timers remembered. The patient had been a young woman, admitted with what was called hysteria in those days, a diagnosis that could mean anything from postpartum depression to inconvenient opinions. She had been restrained in that wheelchair for days, left alone in the room while the staff attended to other patients. One night, she had managed to tip the chair over. By the time they found her, she was gone. But according to the old-timers, she had not gone far. Margaret listened, nodded, and told Denise that she was sure it was just a story. But that night, she found herself standing outside the storage hallway at 3 in the morning, the hour that nurses called the witching hour, the time when the body's reserves were lowest and the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. She did not remember walking there. One moment she was at the nurse's station, charting. The next, she was at the mouth of the corridor, looking into the dark. The door to the wheelchair room was open, and the wheelchair was in the hallway. It sat in the middle of the corridor, facing her. The leather straps hung loose, swaying slightly though there was no draft. The wheels were still, but the seat, the cracked vinyl seat that had held so many patients before the woman in the records, was damp. Margaret saw moisture beading on the surface, running in slow rivulets down the sides. It looked like sweat. It looked like fear made liquid. She should have turned around. She knew she should have turned around. But something in her, something that had been trained to assess, to intervene, to move toward the patient in distress, made her step forward. She walked toward the chair, her footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The lights had stopped flickering. They were steady now, but they cast a sickly yellow glow that made the walls seem to breathe. When she was 3 feet from the chair, she saw that it was not empty. There was a woman sitting in it, or rather, there was the suggestion of a woman. Margaret could see the outline of a body, shoulders, arms, a head tilted slightly to one side, but the figure had no features. It was like looking at a negative of a photograph, a shape made of shadow and cold air. The leather straps, which had been hanging loose, were now taut. They were wrapped around the figure's wrists and ankles, holding it in place. And the figure was struggling. Margaret could see the straps straining, could hear the creak of old leather, could feel the vibrations in the floor as the chair began to rock. Then the figure spoke. Its mouth was a hollow in the shadow, a space that opened and closed without sound at first. But Margaret heard the words inside her own skull, bypassing her ears entirely. "Help me. Please, they left me here. They left me and I can't get out." Margaret reached out. She did not think. Her hand closed around one of the leather straps, and she pulled. The strap was cold, slick with that same moisture she had seen on the seat. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a sound like a gasp. The strap fell to the floor. She moved to the next one, her fingers working the buckle that had not been touched in decades. The second strap opened. The third. The figure in the chair was becoming more solid now, or perhaps less. Margaret could not tell if she was seeing more clearly or if the figure was beginning to dissipate. She opened the fourth strap, the one around the figure's right ankle, and the chair stopped rocking. The hallway was silent. The figure was gone. The chair was empty, the straps lying on the floor like dead snakes. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short gasps. Then she turned and walked back to the nurse's station. She did not look behind her. The next morning, before she left, she went back to the storage hallway. The door to the wheelchair room was closed. She opened it and looked inside. The wheelchair was where it belonged, pushed into the corner, covered with a dust sheet. The straps were fastened neatly, the way they had been for years. But on the seat, someone had placed a single white rose. Margaret had not put it there. She asked Denise about it. Denise shrugged and said she had no idea. Margaret never went into that hallway again. She requested to be permanently assigned to the ICU on the 3rd floor, and her request was granted. For months, she told herself that what had happened was a stress reaction, a waking dream brought on by fatigue and a vivid imagination. She almost believed it. Then, 6 months later, she was working a double shift in the ICU. A young woman was brought in from the 4th floor med-surg unit, a patient who had been admitted for observation after a fall. The patient was agitated, disoriented, her heart rate erratic. Margaret recognized the signs of a developing crisis and moved to stabilize her. As she adjusted the IV line, the patient grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and her voice was a whisper. "The woman in the chair told me to thank you," the patient said. "She said you let her out. She said it's not so dark anymore." Margaret froze. She looked at the patient's chart. The patient had been in room 412, the med-surg unit on the 4th floor. She had been admitted after being found wandering the halls, disoriented, claiming she had heard someone calling for help from a storage closet. The admitting nurse had noted that the patient seemed frightened but could not explain of what. Margaret looked at the patient's face, at the fear fading from her eyes, at the calm that was settling over her features like a veil. The patient's vitals stabilized. She made a full recovery and was discharged 3 days later. Margaret never spoke to her again, but she kept the patient's discharge summary in her locker for the rest of her career. She never showed it to anyone. She never explained why. When Margaret retired, she left the summary in an envelope on the desk of the head nurse. On the envelope, she had written, "Room 412. The storage hallway. Do not use it after midnight. And if you hear someone asking for help, do not go alone." The head nurse read the note and asked around about the storage hallway. The 4th floor staff confirmed that they avoided it, though none of them could say exactly why. The hallway was eventually renovated. The old equipment was removed, the rooms were converted to office space, and the wheelchair was donated to a medical museum. The renovations took 3 months. During that time, 3 separate construction workers reported hearing a woman's voice coming from the walls, asking for someone to let her out. The foreman dismissed it as water in the pipes. But the night after the renovations were completed, the security guard making rounds on the 4th floor reported seeing a woman in a white dress standing at the end of the hallway. He said she was not facing him. She was facing the wall, her head tilted, her hands pressed flat against the drywall as if she were feeling for something. The guard called out to her. She did not turn. When he approached, she was gone. But on the wall where her hands had been, there were 2 damp prints, pressed into the fresh paint from the other side. Story 3. The nursery at dawn. The maternity ward was supposed to be a place of joy. That is what the brochures said, what the hospital administration repeated at every gala and fundraising event. But the night staff knew that joy and sorrow shared the same hallway in that wing. For every mother who left with a healthy infant in her arms, there was another who left with empty arms and a discharge summary that listed a different kind of outcome. The nursery, with its rows of bassinets and its soft, warm lighting, was the heart of the ward. But after midnight, when the lights were dimmed and the monitors beeped their slow, steady rhythms, the nursery took on a different quality. It became a place of waiting. And sometimes, the things that waited were not only the living. Elena was a neonatal nurse with 15 years of experience. She had chosen the specialty because she believed in beginnings. She liked the weight of a newborn in her arms, the fierce grip of tiny fingers, the way a baby would root toward her hand without being able to see it. She had delivered resuscitation to infants who weighed less than a bag of sugar. She had held the hands of mothers who would never hear their child cry. She carried both kinds of memories, and she had learned to hold them without letting them break her. The nursery on the third floor of Mercy General was state-of-the-art, but it was built on the foundation of the old maternity ward, which had been in operation since the 1940s. The renovation had covered the walls with fresh paint and installed new equipment, but the layout remained the same. The nursery was a long, rectangular room with a window that looked out onto the nurses' station. 12 bassinets lined the walls, each one a small, wheeled crib with a clear plastic sides. In the center of the room was the warmer, a table with a radiant heater used for stabilizing newborns who needed immediate attention. The warmer was the most used piece of equipment in the nursery, and it was also the focus of the stories. The stories started with the night shift nurses, as most stories did. They spoke of seeing the warmer activate on its own, the heater clicking on and the temperature display climbing even when no infant was inside. They spoke of hearing a sound from the nursery when no babies were present, a soft, rhythmic cooing that stopped as soon as the door opened. Some said they had seen a shadow move across the window of the nursery door, a shadow that was too small to be an adult and too large to be an infant. Elena dismissed these stories as the result of sleep deprivation and the natural tendency of the human mind to find patterns in random stimuli. She had been a nurse long enough to know that the night shift bred its own folklore. But she could not dismiss what she saw on the night of the winter storm. The storm had knocked out power to half the city, but the hospital's generators kept the essential systems running. The nursery was on emergency power, which meant the lights were dimmer than usual and the monitors were running on battery backups. Elena was the only nurse in the nursery that night, her colleague having called in sick and not been replaced due to the weather. There were 4 infants in the nursery, all stable, all sleeping peacefully in their bassinets. Elena moved between them, checking their temperature, adjusting their blankets, noting their feeding times on the chart. It was just after 2 in the morning when she noticed the warmer. The heater had come on. The temperature display read 36.5 degrees Celsius, the standard setting for a newborn warmer. But there was no infant on the table. Elena walked over and checked the controls. The switch was in the off position. She turned it off again, waited to see if it would click back on, and when it did not, she assumed it was an electrical glitch caused by the generator. She made a note to report it to maintenance in the morning. She was at the charting station when she heard the first cry. It was not a cry from one of the infants in the nursery. She knew their sounds by now: the reedy wail of the premature baby in bassinet 3, the hiccuping protest of the full-term boy in bassinet 7. This cry was different. It was thin, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. And it was coming from the warmer. Elena looked up. The warmer was on again. The heater glowed red through the grill, and the temperature display was climbing past 37 degrees. The surface of the table was empty, but there was a depression in the central pad, as if something were pressing down on it. The depression was the size of a newborn. Elena watched as it shifted slightly, a subtle movement that suggested an infant turning its head. The cry came again, louder this time, and it was not a sound of hunger or discomfort. It was a sound of distress, of need. She approached the warmer slowly, her medical training overriding her unease. She reached out to check the temperature of the pad, to see if there was any physical explanation for what she was seeing. Her hand hovered above the surface, and she felt warmth rising from it, the correct warmth, the warmth that should be there if an infant were lying on the pad. But there was nothing, only the depression, shifting again, and the cry that was now building toward a wail. Elena did what she had been trained to do. She reached out to comfort. She placed her hand on the depression, on the space where an infant's chest would be, and she began to speak in the soft, rhythmic voice she used with all her tiny patience. Shish, shish, I've got you. You're safe. You're warm. I've got you. The crying stopped. The depression held steady under her hand, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt something. A flutter, a heartbeat, so faint that she could have been imagining it, but there. Her hand rested on the pad for a full minute. Then the warmth faded, The depression smoothed out. The heater clicked off. The warmer was empty again. Elena stood there for a long time, her hand still extended, her breath held. Then she withdrew, walked back to the charting station, and sat down. She did not write anything in the log. She did not tell anyone. She sat in the dim light of the nursery, watching the 4 sleeping infants, and she waited. The next morning, she looked up the history of the nursery. The records were in the hospital archive, a collection of old ledgers and microfilm that had been digitized but rarely accessed. She found what she was looking for. In 1948, the old maternity ward had experienced a tragedy. A premature infant, born at 26 weeks, had been placed in a makeshift warmer, a metal crib with hot water bottles and a manual thermometer. The nurse attending the infant had been called away to assist with a delivery. When she returned, the hot water bottles had cooled, and the infant's temperature had dropped to a critical level. They had tried to warm the baby, had placed it on a heated table, had wrapped it in blankets and held it close. But it was too late. The infant died in the early hours of the morning, its cries fading as its body surrendered to the cold. The nurse who had left the infant alone never forgave herself. She worked the nursery for 40 more years, always checking the warmer, always counting the minutes, always carrying the weight of that one failure. The nurse's name was Eleanor. She had retired in 1988 and died in 1995. But according to the records, she had spent her entire career on the night shift. And she had never, in 40 years, let a warmer go unchecked. Elena read the file and closed it. She did not mention it to her colleagues, but she began to notice things in the nursery that she had not noticed before. The warmer would activate at the same time every night, just after 2 in the morning, the time when the infant in 1948 had taken its final breath. The depression would appear, the cry would sound, and Elena would go to the warmer and place her hand on the pad. She would speak to the emptiness, and the emptiness would quiet. It became a ritual. She did not tell anyone because she knew what they would say. They would say she was tired. They would say she was projecting. They would say that a woman who had spent 15 years holding dying infants had finally broken. But Elena knew what she felt. She knew the flutter of a heartbeat against her palm. She knew the way a distressed infant calms when it feels warmth and hears a familiar voice. And she knew that the infant on the warmer, the one who had died alone and cold, was still waiting for someone to come back. 6 months later, a new nurse was hired for the maternity ward. Her name was Rachel, and she was young, eager, and deeply uncomfortable with the night shift. On her first night alone in the nursery, she called Elena at home, her voice shaking. She said the warmer had turned on by itself. She said she could hear crying. She said she did not know what to do. Elena told her to go to the warmer, to place her hand on the pad, and to speak to it. Rachel hesitated, then said she would try. Elena stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, listening to the soft sound of Rachel's voice through the receiver. When Rachel came back on the line, she was crying. She said she had felt something. A heartbeat, small and fast and desperate. She said she had held her hand there until it faded, and she had not been afraid. Elena told her that she would be fine, that the warmer would activate every night at 2 in the morning, and that she should comfort it, and that it would quiet. She told Rachel that there was nothing to be afraid of, that the infant on the warmer was not a ghost. It was a memory of a baby who had died waiting for someone to come back, and of a nurse who had spent 40 years trying to make up for the minutes she had been gone. The two of them, the infant and Eleanor, had become tangled in that moment, repeating it over and over, waiting for someone to break the loop. Rachel worked the night shift in the nursery for 3 years. She never missed a night, and every night at 2 in the morning, she went to the warmer, placed her hand on the pad, and spoke to the emptiness until it quieted. She told no one except Elena. They kept the ritual between them, a secret shared by the women who watched over the smallest and most vulnerable patients in the hospital. When Rachel transferred to pediatrics, she wrote a note and left it taped to the warmer. It said, "This warmer works fine. But if it turns on by itself after midnight, please go to it and place your hand on the pad. Someone needs you to know they are warm." The note stayed there for years, until the warmer was replaced during a renovation. The new warmer was digital, computerized, equipped with automatic temperature regulation and an alarm system. It never turned on by itself. The night nurses on the maternity ward noticed that the nursery felt different after the old warmer was removed. It was quieter, they said. Too quiet, as if something that had been there for decades had finally moved on. Elena came back to the hospital for Rachel's farewell party. They stood in the nursery, looking at the empty space where the old warmer had been. Rachel asked Elena if she thought the infant had finally found peace. Elena thought for a moment. Then she said that she did not think the infant had been waiting for peace. She thought the infant had been waiting for someone to come back, to stay, to be present in that final moment. And after 60 years, someone finally had. Not just one someone, but a chain of someones, all of them nurses, all of them placing their hands on the pad and saying the same thing. "You're warm. You're safe. I've got you." Elena left the hospital a few months later. She did not retire. She simply stopped coming to work. Her colleagues called to check on her, and she told them she was fine, that she had decided to take some time for herself. But Rachel knew. Rachel understood that Elena had been holding the nursery together for 15 years, carrying the weight of that one cold night in 1948, and that she had finally let it go. Rachel still works at Mercy General. She is the head nurse of the pediatrics ward now, but she visits the nursery sometimes, usually after midnight, when the lights are dim and the monitors beep their slow, steady rhythms. She stands in the doorway and listens. The new warmer never activates on its own. The nursery is quiet, but sometimes, when she listens very closely, she can hear something. Not a cry, not a coo, just a soft, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, echoing in the space where the old warmer used to be. It fades as soon as she tries to locate it, and she knows, with a certainty that she does not try to explain, that everything is exactly as it should be. These stories come from the margins of hospital records, whispered in break rooms and passed down through generations of staff who learned to trust what they could not explain. The morgue attendant who spoke to the dead, the nurse who freed a woman trapped in a wheelchair, the ritual of the nursery warmer, repeated night after night until the waiting finally ended. Hospitals are places of thresholds, between life and death, between the known and the unknown. Those who work the night shifts cross those thresholds every day. Some of them return with stories. Others return with silence. But all of them carry something with them when they walk those empty corridors at 3 in the morning. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the staff of these hospitals will tell you the same thing. Listen closely enough, and you will hear the echoes of those who are still waiting. For warmth, for comfort, for someone to remember that they were here. And perhaps, in remembering them, we keep a part of them alive. Perhaps that is all any of us can ask for. To be remembered by the living, to have our stories told, to know that in the quiet hours of the night, someone will place a hand where we once lay and say, "You're safe. You're warm. I've got you."